Thank you so much for joining us. Now, so many people love you well, they remember that you brought the future into their lives when you were presenting Tomorrow's World. And now we're living a little bit, well, possibly a little bit further into the future that you painted for us, effectively. And you're as strong an advocate for the scientific world as ever. But what I find quite interesting is before it all began, you wanted to be a vet. And that's what slightly ignited your interest in science. And I just wondered if you could tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, as a young teenager, this has helped me so much with the work that I do now, where I'm working with teenagers and trying to help them understand. It's a really big world out there. There's many things you could do, but my world was quite narrow. I lived out in the countryside. I thought in terms of my future, I wanted to have a job that meant I could be outdoors, and I loved animals. I particularly loved horses. My parents at that stage, we couldn't afford a horse. So I felt my pathway to having a horse was becoming a vet. And I've always remembered my seemingly logical thinking behind that, because that's how a lot of kids think. It's not about I really enjoy these subjects. That isn't where you start always with what you want to do. Sometimes there's a certain thing that you really want to achieve or do, and that will really drive you. And so, in terms of exciting young people, understanding what it is that they really love can be a pathway into opening their mind. Because if you'd said to me as a young teenager, all right, so you really like horses, do you? Well, what if you thought about whether it was sort of a radical new way of feeding horses, and that would have been an entry point into chemistry for me. Or so I did want to be a vet. And then so I knew the sciences were really important, and physics and maths were fine. But ironically, chemistry, for whatever reason, I just could not get my head round. I really couldn't get my head around it. And I was a very proud teenager. And I thought, well, I'm not going to fail my O level, so I will not take it. I will not do it. And I dropped it. And then years later, when I was on Tomorrow's World, I thought, what was it I found so hard? Because I'm meeting people who work in, whether it's in chemical engineering or whatever, and I'm able to grasp really quite complicated ideas. To this day, I don't know what it was. And it's very easy to go, oh, well, you didn't get on with the teacher or whatever. And I'm not lazy enough to say it was because of a teacher. I don't know, maybe it was the syllabus or whatever it was. But yeah, I wanted to be a vet. And if you go into many schools now and you've got young girls who are interested in the sciences, so many of them will say, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a vet, might be a pharmacist. It's quite narrow. And as whether you're talking about the world of chemistry or the world of engineering or technology, there are 1,000,001 jobs and career pathways and different routes in. And yes, some of them will require you to have really good A-level grades and go on to university. There are other routes through apprenticeships. So there are, and still young people don't get that information in time.
No, you're right. I so identify with that completely. The lack of inspiration that goes on, I think, in some educational settings. And maybe not all, and maybe you get a one-off, but whatever you experienced is the potluck that you ended up with, and that's the one that you have as the grounding for your life.
And it's really tough on schools and teachers because they want to provide that rich experience. And the thing that really drives me is a need to change what happens in schools so that the teachers have a bit more freedom to actually teach. Because it's sad, isn't it, that if you've got a class of, I don't know, 25, 30 in front of you, and you've got to get through certain things, if you've got a kid with their hand up going, oh, can you just explain a bit more? Or what about, and they mention something which is, slightly off the path that the rest of the class are on, you've not got the time to answer that question. You've just got to shut it down. And for some young people, they will go along with all that. For others, if they're constantly shut down, they'll close off from that subject and just go, well, it's not for me. Obviously.
And that really is a shame. You're right. They should have a bit, well, in my opinion, I agree with you, a little bit more freedom to let children ask the questions and go down those areas of interest that come to mind in the moment.
Yeah, because they are naturally curious.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're able to tap into that curiosity, then you are absolutely opening windows and doors for them. It's a lovely thing to be able to do.
Exactly.
And equally,
Luckily.
if you build on something that a young person is interested in, and I mentioned that thing about perhaps you could think of a radical new way of feeding horses, because there was a student in our Teen Tech Awards program who did exactly that. And I thought, oh, this is like little me. And her knowledge was extraordinary, way beyond. I mean, she was, I don't know, 13 years old, and what she had produced in this project was way beyond A level, way beyond. But she was interested. And yeah, how lovely it would be just to give schools a little bit more freedom. And I'm not saying that this approach works for everybody, but it works for a substantial number of young people who at the moment are stultified or squashed or made to feel no good by the systems we have in place.
So you really did stop going down that route because you didn't get chemistry, which is understandable. You know, it's not necessarily obvious why you're doing it at the time. If I remember, I couldn't quite translate what I was learning in chemistry to a real life scenario, which you know, I'm comfortable saying was the fault of the teacher. But nevertheless, you maintained an interest in science.
Yeah.
What was it? What hooked you,
Well,
despite not pursuing it as a career in its own right?
Well, I was always interested in the world and the way it worked and the way it functioned. And I was that kid who dismantled things and tried to build things, and also tried to, in my own small way, invent stuff. That I had that kind of mindset. And my dad actually was, I mean, he was an accountant, but he was really interested in technology himself. And so he encouraged me to think about it. So I never lost touch with being interested. And I suppose, rather like you're sort of saying, how can you relate that interest you've got into what might be a future career? Now, I certainly didn't think for a minute that I would be able to turn that into a future career. But with the benefit of hindsight, I can see there were all sorts of things that I was doing on the side because I was interested. So for instance, I took a year out, which was very unusual at that time to do after school. And it was purely because I was in such a mess. I'd done arts A levels because I'd done an absolute 360-degree turn. And I was still, had this gnawing feeling. I'm still not quite sure I know what I want to do. But one of the jobs I took in that year out was I worked at a theatre, and I worked in the lighting department and the sound department of that theatre. And one of the roles I had was it was a technical role, and I loved it, really loved it. Again, didn't really think this was something I could turn into a career, but I was doing it because I was interested and I loved it. And obviously all these things were, stacking up, so that when many years later, after I left, I left university, and I'd done a few years presenting on children's telly, and I was asked to join Tomorrow's World, I absolutely felt like I'd come home. It was wonderful. I hesitated before I took the job because I was still haunted by not having done O-level chemistry. It still haunted me. But it was like going to university all over again, except doing the sciences, and also doing the sciences in admittedly a rather keyhole form. So you become an expert on an absolutely granular part of science. And then you had to really get across the background that lay behind whatever that granular piece of science was. But it was really interesting. And obviously what Tomorrow's World taught me was storytelling, how you actually tell a story. And, that applies in the classroom or on telly, that being able to tell a story, knowing where does it start? What is the point where someone will go, oh, I've really got to find out more about this. This is really interesting me. yeah, so it was wonderful to have. I felt like I'd got a second chance, actually, when
Wow.
I did as well. I thought, this is my second chance. And funny enough, I was with a whole group of people, producers and presenters, who worked on Tomorrow's World very, very recently, and we were just talking about how incredibly fortunate we were to have the luxury of exploring, topics which sometimes were absolutely way beyond the horizon, as well as being developed as research projects at university. It was absolutely fabulous, and I loved it. So this is a very long-winded way of answering your question, and I think that fundamentally I was a very, very am and remain a very curious person.
Mm-hmm.
I like finding out new things, and I like learning new things. And I think probably now, because I am so very ancient, I'm less worried about failing. So I know that sometimes it might take you a while to grasp something, or you might not be right all the time. And I'm quite comfortable with that.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I think it's important, because this is because the point really about why I'm so keen to help young people understand why a good knowledge of science and tech is important isn't just because there are great careers, which obviously there are, but it's also because having a level of scientific literacy has never been more important. Because people, whether it's on the telly or social media or where, people talk sometimes a load of absolute rubbish, and you have to be able to question them. And you have to understand, hang on a minute, I'm not so sure about that. And if you've just got a level of literacy, you would think, well, they're saying they've done that piece of research. How big, how many people were in it? Oh, research base of 15 people. Well, might not be quite so sound. But just being able to question things, being able to understand why. Because sometimes in science there can be a right and a wrong. Sometimes in science there is we don't really know, we're still trying to find out, and that's also important. And sometimes science is very much about going, well, we thought that, but now we have we've got new information, or we've got re-examined the data, or whatever has happened, and we now think something else. And that is what happens with science, that whole process. And I think that was the thing that was shown so clearly across the pandemic, was people not understanding that what was happening was that everyone was learning.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you need to have a certain amount of agility, mental agility, to understand that, yes, we thought this then, but 3 weeks later, 3 months later, we now think this. And there's a reason behind that. It perhaps might not have been amazingly well communicated as to the development in that comparatively short space of time. And it would have been hard, I think, because of the lens that was on it. It was a spotlight to everyone. I don't think there's would there have been anything like it? Certainly not with the accessibility to the media channels that we have nowadays, with so many, the majority of the nation fixated on one thing because it was affecting them all, and then feeling like they were being shoved from pillar to post because, as the commentary was going, the science changed. But of course, that's the nature of science, and that's the point of it. It will change. It should change.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as I say, that comes into that science literacy, and why it is really important that we maybe look at the science curriculum so that it's delivering not only for the scientists of the future, but for the really valuable citizens of the future.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I said when I introduced you, almost quite assumptively, that we're perhaps a little bit further into the future than Tomorrow's World might have offered. But I wondered if there was anything that they said would be around, or that we've gone light years beyond, or that hasn't, or that is just starting just now, or just completely crashed and burned.
Yeah, it's really intriguing, because what we did a lot, particularly in the era that I worked on Tomorrow's World, which was throughout most of the 80s and then early 90s, was we looked at a lot of areas of both science and technology in a very keyhole fashion. So we would have a particular piece of tech, and what I've seen happen over quite a long period of time has been, when these areas have actually come together in some way. I think that is perhaps another issue with the way we approach all of our teaching, actually, that we put artificial dividers in line. So where do you draw the line between chemistry and maths, or chemistry and biology, or chemistry and data science?
Such a good point.
And or chemistry and ethics. All of these things are entwined, aren't they? So it's I think we need to look at not having subject areas in these neat little pockets and thinking that we can box them off, because increasingly, that mix of of subject areas is driving forward the future. So in terms of things which I demonstrated, I always remember very clearly standing in front of the massive satellite dishes at Goonhilly in Cornwall and saying, this is the dawn of a digital era. And I can date it precisely because I was pregnant at the time and my daughter is now 35 years old. So it was quite prescient. and obviously we are still building on that prediction. That whole, when you look at the way various things have changed what chemistry is over that period of time, and a lot of it is to do with data. But in general, if something was going to be a success on Tomorrow's World, it could take around 15 years. That was often as I say, that was the position in the 80s when obviously there were certain things that we demoed, but many things took about 15 years to move forward. And so it's easier to sort of see some of the successes. But the big themes of Tomorrow's World, like where is the energy coming from in the future? How are we going to feed the world in the future? Those questions we're still trying to answer in a truly satisfying way. These are the big questions of our time. We're still struggling, aren't we, to work out, well, what is the answer? What do we do?
The terrible trouble is, it seemed then that those were, almost academic questions, and we're getting further down the timeline to the point where they're really not academic, but it somehow feels that they're being still treated academically, conceptually, rather than practically.
I think it's very hard for people to grasp that, that things like climate change, the movement of populations, that this is, these are the really massive issues of our time, and we've just got to be a bit more generous in the way that we go about sorting them out. I was just delighted when finally we're back in the EU science framework.
Right, 20, yeah,
absolutely. I know what fantastic news that was, because having scientists able to work together is the only way forward on all of this. And then there's another big a slight social hat on here, is we've just got to get our heads around the fact that when we're producing solutions, these have to be whole world solutions. This solution has to work for everybody, because it has to work for everybody. I always remain optimistic about what can be achieved with science and tech. But sometimes when you see the divisive nature of, and the way a political system is really encouraging divisiveness amongst its own, the population around issues which actually are relatively trivial, you'd think, gosh, this is like, this is a massive mountain to climb, when people are deliberately being polarized about what they think about something. And as you think, well, how on earth are people going to come to terms with the fact that, here in the West, there are probably some fairly massive compromises that are going to be made around lifestyle, because we have to support a whole planet, not just the fact that we want to have, I don't know, a massive American fridge or whatever. There are bigger things at stake.
Encourage the Americans to have little English fridges.
No, I know, but you see, you're looking at someone who can remember the arrival of the fridge in my house. It was a very exciting moment. I think I was about 6 years old, and my parents got a fridge, and that meant we could make our own lollies because it had an ice compartment. It's a tiny fridge.
Luxury.
It was absolutely the most exciting thing. So yeah, it's very funny how now we all think we need so much more.
Yeah, I think it's a real, well, I don't know what the word is, but you have to choose really between aspiration and impact. I suppose you have to constantly understand that everything you do has an effect on everything else.
Yeah.
It's a hard one, and especially you mentioned that the political landscape. I just as that of a divisive landscape, and I wonder when that actually happened, because my recollection when I was growing up was that we had a government that governed and it didn't feel divisive then when I was growing. It really didn't feel divisive even in my teens, and perhaps even in my early 20s. The election times, of course, were quite brutal, but I don't remember the actual in between governing times feeling divisive. I think that's quite a comparatively new feature. My feeling is we have to lead by example. If we can change it in the science and technology world and lead by example, then it'll have that impact on what may have gone wrong politically. If we can say anything's gone wrong, it might just be a natural evolution. I don't know. I'd like to think that we could return to that cohesive nature of governing that I remember when I was growing up.
It's interesting, isn't it? I'm not I wouldn't classify myself as being incredibly articulate about politics, but I do watch obviously what's happening, and the thing that disturbs me, I don't know whether you can say it began with Brexit, but Brexit certainly highlighted a level of polarization, and where people would shout what they believed with their hands over their ears and wouldn't listen. And this has obviously led to a lot of discomfort in terms of where we are now in the UK, because there wasn't there was no honest debate at all around what Brexit might actually mean, and also why it was being done. It was almost like it was like a massive battle happening on a field, completely encased in fog and noises just coming out of the battlefield. So you had no idea really what was actually going on. It was, what the things that were being said, from crazy campaign slogans written on buses and all the rest of it, was nonsense. It was all nonsense. And then we're left with an outcome which everyone is unhappy with. No one feels happy. The people who wanted Brexit are going, but this isn't the Brexit we wanted. And then the people who didn't want Brexit are going, well, there you are. We said we didn't want,
Which is divisive in its own right, even that retrospective on it, how can you move past that, or we told you so moment? That's not helpful either, really. I think, accept what's happened, make the best of it, whether it was right or wrong is almost largely irrelevant now, as I don't know who said it, but we are where we are. But I think then if we then refocus on it from that science angle, the question is then how can we improve nationally as a sector? I mean, you mentioned Horizon, that's brilliant. We're back in the project, that driving forward and being able to work in collaboration internationally is going to be a great help. And hopefully maybe that'll have a knock-on effect with the curriculum as well. What do you think it might, or is it simply answering the big questions of our age?
Well, I think with things like Horizon, so it's an old truism, isn't it? Several heads being better than one, and sharing, the way other countries are approaching the the teaching at whatever level, whether it's at university, whether it's at primary school level, then there are things that can always be learned. And I think it is just maybe about being able to work out, well, what are we trying to achieve with, especially with the early years, primary, first few years of secondary, because that's where people either seem to develop a love of science and enjoy it, and don't see it as a hard subject, or the opposite, where they go, oh, I'm not sciencey, and they think, oh, I don't want anything to do with this. And we seem to lose our way slightly, because there's so much, very sort of basic levels. For instance, there's so much chemistry in things like cooking. There's so much chemistry in art, simply mixing the paints, or whatever medium you're using. This is chemistry. But somehow there's this feeling, oh, well, art is fun. Art is, I'm not saying easy, but anyone can pick a paintbrush up, this thinking. Whereas chemistry, that's quite difficult. But yeah, I think we need to really look at the way we approach the teaching of certain things. It could be much fresher, couldn't it?
I really like what you said before about actually removing those barriers in between the subjects. I think that really does a lot, differentiating between those really focused subjects: chemistry, biology, art, maths. They are all interwoven. I feel like that's a really poignant point.
I think it is really important, and you need all of these things, elements of those different subjects. I'm very interested in what the Welsh government are doing. They have a new curriculum, which is, and I'm not going to do justice to the Welsh curriculum now by trying to describe it, but it is around not making those firm lines between subjects. Mm-hmm. Where students have got the opportunity to develop work on what I would say it's rather more project-based learning, and then you pull in knowledge from various different areas. I know some teachers have felt quite nervous about it's a different approach. Mm-hmm. But I think it's an interesting way, because it's so much more easy to relate that approach to what you said earlier, which is the real world, because you're not always having to think, well, why am I even doing this? It's very obvious why you're doing it, because you've got whatever the project is. It's a real world project. Yeah. So your knowledge is related to something that is tangible. You can see why you need to learn whatever it is to create the project that you want to have as your final piece. That my instinct is that is a really good way to learn, and that you learn more. I can absolutely see it can be a more challenging approach in terms of teaching, because you've got 30 kids doing their thing. So I can absolutely see that, but also the skills that you're learning in a sense, because this is the other thing, isn't it? It's that the learning never ever stops. It never ever stops. So the most important thing to do is to learn how to learn.
Yeah, I completely agree. That approach is a little bit more like learning as an adult and learning on the job, and getting used to that feeling of starting something when you really don't know how to do it, and then being able to just pick little things up on the way, break it down into manageable bite-sized pieces, and then roll with it, learn. Some bits you'll like, some bits you won't like, but overall you get the job done. And that's I think it's a much more realistic grounding for the real world. Mm. It's a really, really interesting. I hadn't heard about that.
I think it's an approach worth watching.
Certainly.
Yeah. They have felt that what has been referred to as STEM should that they need to that those subjects are entwined, because there's maths in most things, maths in geography. So having things, seen to exist in pockets, isn't always helpful for certain students. And obviously, if you want to become, a biochemist or a mathematician or the rest of it, well, yes, you are going to progress to a depth of knowledge, and there will be certain things which you will need to understand and be able to work with. I'm not about simplifying things, but I am about think about how you might want to try an engagement process that works for more people, because at the moment it's working for some, but it would be really good if it worked for more, whilst you don't want to trivialize the subject in any way. But you can see the impact when students who are completely capable of progressing in a subject get tripped up at a very early stage.
I wonder if it's because it made it complicated for marking. It'd be interesting to see how they managed to do that in Wales, how they managed to mark everyone, because part of me thinks that the motivation is slightly skewed because of exam results. Because if it wasn't all about with exam results and it was about inspiring children and getting the best out of them without having to prove it per se by demonstrating the exam results, I wonder if that could maybe lead to something a little bit more exciting. I don't know. It'll be really interesting to see how that unfolds.
You see, that is an idea, isn't it?
Mm.
It's quite interesting. There are a number of companies now who are not recruiting on exam results.
Oh, are they really? That's good. I think that's good, at least. I mean, aptitude and soft skills and all the rest of it. And like you say, not to detract from anyone who's put their all into a particular subject and become a master of it. Brilliant. We need that too. But not everyone's going to do that. So this is for everyone else, really, I think.
Well, it's around, I suppose that what some organizations have learned is that academic qualifications are certainly not everything in terms of assessing whether or not someone is going to be a great fit within your company. And if your company really does require people within it to keep up to speed with whatever's happening, then making sure that everyone who joins it is really keen to learn new things, and really cares about whatever it is that your company does and produces, whether it is tech or whether whatever it is, packaging or what, but that you care about it, then that is really important, because you will go a lot further with someone who is happy to understand why, well, we may have made our packaging materials out of whatever before, but we're not going to do that anymore, because of the environment. So we're going to rechange all of that, and doesn't get too hung up on the fact that you've got to completely get your head around something else. But yeah. So I find that I find that refreshing. That has been that they have identified these things are more important than the number of GCSEs or A levels or even degrees that somebody might have.
Yeah, very much so. I wonder sometimes when people are in those professional settings, what actually motivates them more, whether it's their desire to solve an existing problem, or if it's their imagination about what could possibly be without actually having identified a problem first, whether you've noticed the difference in people and how it affects them in their work.
We've run like the Teen Tech Award program for, I think we're in our 11th year now. And as you say, there are two approaches to innovation. There are, I've got this amazing idea approach. And then you try and think, well, where could my amazing idea be used? And then the other approach is identifying a problem, something, it might be a really trivial problem. It might be a personal problem. It might be a global one, but whatever it is something you can identify. And then, well, how might I find a solution? What might I actually do? And the second thing tends to be much more satisfying in terms, you get much further with doing something in that kind of way. It's not to dismiss the first approach completely. I'm not doing that. I'm just saying. And so what, from my experience, has been quite interesting is how far young people are prepared to go when they do identify a problem, which is very meaningful. And some of these problems can be very sort of sophisticated. So for instance, this year, we've had a young person who had She spent a couple of years in hospital, felt that boundaries were not always observed. And what happened a lot was that she had to keep explaining what her boundaries were to members of staff within the hospital. So she has worked on an app which will help members of staff very quickly see patient X, which sets out, how that patient feels about certain things. Now, this is I think, quite a sophisticated idea. And, she's a young student, and she took that has taken that idea quite a long way. And she's being supported now. Some people within children's hospitals are interested in her thinking. So that had come from absolutely understanding a problem. She totally understood that problem. And many of the teenagers' projects that we see come from real, lived experience of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
So it might be, say that happened to be one which was based in patient care.
Mm-hmm.
There was, a kid who was fed up with having to change the tires on his bike if he was, when he's like on the road or off-roading and all the rest of it. So he developed an innovation that, sorted that particular issue out. And so it is that I think that being able to create projects based on a problem, and sometimes projects on lived experience, because you totally understand that problem because you have faced it. I always say to the kids, you are experts at being teenagers. Nobody, people at Apple, whoever, they are not as an expert on the teenager as you are. So think about, what matters to you, what irritates you, what would you like to see. It's interesting how far they will go.
Indeed. You've mentioned Teen Tech a few times, and I haven't mentioned that you are CEO and co-founder of Teen Tech, and you started it with your co-founder, as you said, 11 or so years ago. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about Teen Tech and what really triggered you into starting it in the first place?
It was a number of things that I guess came together at the same time, which was seeing that young people were really interested in science and tech, because I think back it was sort of 2007 when we first started to think about it, was that the received impression was they're not interested, so we must go out there and inspire them. That was what people thought. But when you talk to kids, actually they were interested, but they were not interested in the experiences that they were having at school, because it seemed remote from the real world, and they couldn't for the life of them grasp how what they were doing at school had anything to do with the gadgets or that they were so fascinated by. So, and my own daughter, she was a teenager at the time, and she was no exception to this. And so it was just motivated by wanting to help kids make that connection with people doing really interesting things in science and tech at every level and within all disciplines. And so that's how that's how it began. And then we just were quite meticulous about measuring impact.
How did you do that?
Well, you can measure on the day impact fairly easily, without making huge claims for it. So within a day or a session, you can start, heavily underlined in bold, start to change a young person's perceptions about a particular industry or career pathway, and then you have to build on it. And so we do a mixture of things with the idea of giving young people what you might call a series of stepping stones. So they might come to a Teen Tech Festival and think, gosh, there's rather more to this world of science and tech than we imagine. Then they might think, oh, maybe I'll do a Teen Tech Award project. And then we start to connect the students with we call them mentors, but they are virtual mentors the student may have an idea, they will provide feedback along the way. And the point isn't so much the project as the connections that the student is making along the way. That's the point of the award program. And so what we've seen is that and it takes time, is that students enjoy this process. They're meeting some really cool people. One day it might be an apprentice from Airbus, one day it might be the CTO of Disney, but a real mix of people doing different things, who provide inspiration in different ways. And the aim is to help that young person reassess their own potential, both their potential in achieving, because they will often surprise themselves as well as their teachers with what they can achieve, but also their personal qualities. So they start to see, actually, I'm really good at coming up with ideas, or I quite enjoy doing research and, working out, well, might this work or might it not? Or I'm good at, being, leading a team and actually making sure that the project gets submitted on time. They learn all sorts of things and they surprise themselves. And some of those things might be specific skills or pieces of learning around an area of chemistry or biology or data science. There might be a piece of learning, but I guess also just that they enjoy the whole process and they discover that this is really, this is really enjoyable. Over time, the contact with Teen Tech, they just see the different pathways into industry, and we get them into as many companies as we possibly can, so that they can see, oh, there's people like me there, and this is approachable, and actually this is, because different things work in different ways. For some kids, it will be, oh gosh, this is the most amazing building, I'd like to work here. Look, they have all that free food. It's really crazy, but that is what makes a difference.
What kind of companies are you working with?
All sorts. So you'll have organizations, so big organizations like the NHS, because we want the students to see, yes, you could be a doctor, yes, you could be a surgeon. However, there's quite a lot of things happening within the NHS that you might really enjoy doing. So we have, events on NHS sites, on companies like Atkins, for instance, a design and construction company. So with the same aim of saying, it's not all about wearing a hard hat and tramping out in the mud. There's quite a lot of things, and we work on many different projects. And it could be, a tech company. But I mean, basically, we just want the students to understand that inside every building that they probably walk past on their way to school, there are many different opportunities, all within their reach.
Yeah, it's really inspiring. It's so exciting to know that something like this is happening and exists, and that so many companies are able to get involved in supporting what you're doing for students. I think that's how we drive things. The curriculum's one thing, but at the end of the day, we can just get up and do it ourselves.
Yeah. No, and these things do make a difference. The reason I said it's easy to measure impact on one day, but you can't claim massive changes in one day. It's madness to think. I always get a bit cross when I see anyone sort of say, oh, we went into this school and now they all want to be they all want to work in science or whatever. This is nonsense. But over time, you really can make a difference to the way a young person feels about themselves and their confidence in the future, whatever that might be. And I mean, at the moment we're doing a program on ethics, because we want young people to be able to articulate what they feel is okay and what they feel is not okay in the whole world of innovation. And these things are important for all of us. It's not just about, so I guess what I'm trying to say is, it's not just about, we will do this so that you will go on and you will be an electrical engineer, or you will work in a lab, or you'll work and make all sorts of developments in terms of food, or whatever it might be. It's not about pushing young people into science and tech careers. It is about absolutely lighting a bit of a fuse, so perhaps more of them will think, actually, I really could do that. But it's absolutely about giving those young people a sense of whether I do this as a career or not, this is something that really does matter. And there's a lot that I can do to make sure that I am across as much of this as I should be, so that I can help, vote for parties who are actually saying the things which matter. Or I can write, that old-fashioned thing of a letter to the Times if I disagree with something. If I want to protest about something, I will absolutely understand and be able to articulate what it is I feel isn't right. Having, a grounding in ethical innovation and what matters is really important. And the reason we're doing that with young people is that I feel young people are often considered in terms of ethics, but they're not part of the conversation. And I really want them to be part of the conversation.
Yeah, again, makes a lot of sense. And maybe even they might want to be politicians themselves. Who knows?
No, but it's important, isn't it? Because again, sweeping generalization about to happen alert is, for a long time, we seem to have had so many politicians who do PPE at university. I'm not saying it's not a good subject. I'm sure it is great, to do, but they do PPE and then they go and work as a SPAD or whatever. And then, we do need more scientific thinkers, people who absolutely deeply understand the science and can communicate it, because that's the world that we live in.
It is.
Yeah.
It certainly is. So what's your vision for the future? Do you think we should fill Parliament up with scientists, or is there some bit more bit less extreme approach that you think we should take?
Scientists have got better and better at being able to have conversations and involve everybody in those conversations. I think there's so much that we can do just to help everybody understand the nuances of science, how it isn't black and white, it's not right and wrong. That science is something which is constantly evolving, and that what was right and was absolutely the correct thing to do 5 years ago may not be what's right and correct now. And it doesn't mean that we've just changed our minds, it's just we've developed our thinking, and this is part of the whole process. So I think helping everyone really believe that and not see it as some kind of a weakness, well, why didn't you know this then? Why am I only finding out now? And I think scientists can help in, I think there is a huge responsibility of people to take some level of ownership to developing their own knowledge as opposed to their own opinion, because that's slightly different, isn't it?
Differentiation. I like it.
Yeah, it's slightly different. And I am an optimist, so I think the world will be saved by scientists and engineers working for the greater good and not for the commercial advantage of a particular company.
Well, I like to share your optimism. I think that's a wonderful note, and I think we should end on that wonderful note. Maggie, thank you so much for joining us today. That was a really interesting chat. And before we go, we should say that you're going to be at Lab Innovations as well, aren't you?
Yes, I am. Yeah, so do come and join, and
yeah,
we'll have a fun chat, and then the awards thing later in the day.
Lab Innovations Awards.